Going live? Okay, now it should be live.
Or at least going live in 0 seconds.
Right. Going live soon. Let's see what happens if I... Oh, here we are. We're live. Excellent.
Perfect.
Hello, world.
No, I see us. I see our four faces.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Oh, here we are. We're live.
Wait. I can hear your voice, Donnie, from the
Well,
past.
Don, you're gonna have to mute
I
that tab.
recommend muting your Facebook because it's like 20 seconds behind. So
Oh, gotcha.
if you want to keep it open for... Oh, Calvin. What's up, Calvin?
Hi, Calvin.
He commented.
Yep. Oh, that makes
Hey,
sense.
Calvin.
So I've been watching these. So Tuck Andrus has been doing these like Tuck's tips for guitar on Facebook. I don't know if you guys have been seeing them, but they're incredible. And he always answers comments, but he answers like way late, and I didn't understand why. But now I guess it makes sense.
I see.
It's the cutest thing. It's the.
You may know this, Donnie, but Tuck is actually largely responsible for me quitting the guitar when I was in high school. So.
Right. Yeah. He posted some concert video of himself from the 80s the other day.
Oh my!
It was pretty, like, ridiculously technically virtuosic player. Like,
Yeah, and yet such an unassuming and humble guy. That's why I love his instructional stuff. It's just
it's really great.
very human, and at the same time really meticulous about how he actually does what he does.
I saw he was playing Moon River the other day because like someone requested it or something, and he was like, I really don't know this song, and then he played it. And he was like, so like if I had to teach you a lesson from my playing of this song, you shouldn't play a song you don't know. You should only play songs you know because I just embarrassed myself, and you
It's a
should.
good lesson.
It was a great lesson.
Though somehow I suspect it probably didn't sound that embarrassing.
No, exactly. It sounded great, but it wasn't really like strict to the change. I mean, you never know with these things whether it's because he's taking interpretive freedoms, or okay, how many people? We have 13 people watching us. It's so exciting.
We should wait till it's not an unlucky number.
That's true.
Or we can exert agency and look past the notion that luck is what's going to shape our fortunes.
That does sound like a good course of action.
Let's
Okay.
do it.
Shall we?
All right.
Yeah.
Well, we good?
I don't see why not.
All right. Well,
Let's
hello
go.
hello to everyone who's tuned in. I hope everyone is doing well and adjusting successfully to a very unique fall. YJC is super excited to get this virtual semester underway. We have a lot of cool things and events coming up in the future that we have planned to sort of work remotely. Just to give you a little sneak peek, we have a jazz-themed magazine we're working on, so keep an eye out for that. And we're also organizing a virtual concert in honor of Charlie Parker, whose 100th birthday would have been last month. So if you'd like to be involved with that, any student is welcome to be involved. So just definitely reach out to us. But that will be happening on September 25th, so 2 weeks from today. And if you are not already, make sure to check out our website, which is yujc.org, and also sign up for our mailing list if you haven't. That's so you can stay updated on our events and talks and performances and all that jazz. So, okay, without further ado, I am very personally excited to have the opportunity of introducing Noah Baerman. Noah is an acclaimed jazz musician, pianist, composer, educator, and activist. He has released 11 records under his own name, one of which came out pretty recently, and we're going to talk a lot about that. He's played with a variety of groups and ensembles and been a part of a lot of very cool projects. And the bottom line, Noah has a lot of wisdom to share. And I'm really so happy that we have the chance to host him and talk to him today. And I'm glad that you are all going to be able to bear witness to that wisdom. So without further ado, it's the second time I've said that. I'm going to hand it off to Donnie and Adine and let the conversations commence.
Thanks everybody for joining. Before we get started with our conversation, I'd like to give Noah the opportunity to present a tune of his. So if you would like to introduce it, that'd be great.
Sure. And I guess slight correction, the album that this is from, Love Right, is actually coming out on October 9th. So um, unless you were part of the process of mixing or recording this, you will be among the very first to hear this. So this is just an excerpt from a 20 plus minute long recording of a suite called Cliff Palace, and I can talk more about it afterwards. The personnel is Chris Allen on alto saxophone, Nadia Nordhaus on trumpet, Kate Tenaik on euphonium, Henry Lugo on bass, Tyshawn Sori on drums, and me on piano. And this was the suite was made possible. The composition of the suite was made possible by the Guilford Performing Arts Festival, who honored me with their artist award for composition 2 years ago, and the piece was premiered last fall, at which point we also recorded it. So without any further ado, here's a little clip from Cliff Palace. Thanks. So I guess you got to buy the record if you want to hear the rest of it. But, so, yeah, should I elaborate on that, or do you
Yeah,
have?
that'd be great. That'd be great.
So, content warning, tragedy and domestic violence. The album that this comes from is called Love Right, and it is a tribute to a friend and former student of mine, Claire Randall, who was murdered a little less than 4 years ago. And the album essentially documents, on some level, it's a tribute to her, and in a sense, a document of my grieving process. And it would be an oversimplification to suggest that it goes from joy to tragedy to heartbreak to philosophical reflection to hope. But on some level, it's more or less that kind of trajectory in music, some of it instrumental, much of it vocal. Different ensemble on each piece. They're actually, not counting me, there are 100 different performers on the. It was conceived as a double LP, and I've subsequently decided to release the music digitally, though with, for those who want a physical experience, a booklet. So the booklet's actually going to be really cool. It's off to press now. It's like an 8-panel on each side accordion fold that expands out to collage with all the performers on one side, and a sort of map pointing out who they all are, along with notes and credits on the other side. So Cliff Palace would have been side 2 of record 1 of the 2 LP set, and so it's based on a trip that I took with my wife to the Kate, who plays euphonium on that track, though she's a visual artist primarily by trade. And we went to the American Southwest, and it was on a visit to the Pueblo 13th century cliff dwellings in Mesa Verde National Park in Colorado, that a lot of these sounds came to me somewhat spontaneously, along with philosophical reflection, hearing about the ways that different groups of Pueblo people were dealing with, among different communities, with adversity, with getting through difficult situations. And some of it really heartwarming, and some of it kind of upsetting. And in a way, for me, instrumental music is a particularly potent way to express complicated or conflicted or ambivalent emotions. If it's something straightforward enough that you can just articulate it, it's ultimately a lot simpler to just say it. Whereas this is one of the places where we need music when the emotions are equally intense but not as strictly definable. That's the deal with Cliff Palace.
Thank you. I guess I wanted to ask about the album more generally.
Sure.
At what point, like, so this was obviously tremendously difficult time, and how did the concept of developing and of making an album as a tribute, or making music as a tribute? Obviously, it's something that's very emotionally powerful. And how did that idea formulate? And if you could sort of walk us through the development of the concept, or the continued development of the concept.
Sure. Thank you. It's, in this instance, I feel like it was sort of organic. I don't want to suggest that I didn't have agency over the process, but a lot of it, I feel like, when things are clicking for me as an artist, I would say, which is to say, when I'm really tuned in, there's a sense as though it's involuntary. I know that it's not literally involuntary, that I'm making choices and I'm following through on tasks and so on, but it can feel that way at times, that I go through the process of ostensibly writing a tune, and then in the end, I don't actually, I remember sitting down and deciding on the notes and writing them down, but on some level I felt more like I excavated something and sort of found the proper wavelength to hear this piece of music that already existed and transcribe it essentially. And so on a kind of broad scope, that happened here. I After Claire was murdered, I was expecting that the well would run pretty dry for me for a while, just artistically in general, and especially in terms of expressing those emotions. And after about a month, I had an experience that I won't get into detail. You can check out the album, depicted in the song "Beautiful and Cruel." But I had an experience thinking about her that I explained in a certain way. In the act of explaining it, a phrase came to me. The phrase became a song. I mean, I sort of basically sat down with a pad, and 45 minutes later, there it was. And there were several points after that where, for one reason or another, the germ of an idea or the sort of the point of entry into finding one of these pieces of music came to me. And at a certain point, I had accumulated enough of that I started thinking about it more as a project rather than just a bunch of coincidentally related fragments. And I one of the reasons it has taken so long to turn that into something that the public is that I was really determined to let the process remain as organic as possible for as long as possible. The reality of creating something that you share with people is that there are often deadlines, and the deadlines lead you to certain crossroads where if the thing doesn't flow organically, you still have to put something on paper to put in front of the musician who's going to play it a week from now. And I wanted to minimize the amount of that kind of decision making and essentially just allow myself to, if part of it on a, for lack of a better term, self-indulgent level was just using it for my own healing and trusting. I was just talking with a student about this morning, actually, the idea that if you are committed to being, and I hope this is true for me, I will leave that to critics and or St. Peter to figure out, I suppose, but if you are committed to developing part of it on a, if you're committed to developing as a moral person who's tuned into one's own priorities and goals and ethics and so on, if you are cultivating a self that is righteous, not self-righteous, but a self that is who you intend to be and tuned into the world around, then doing something self-indulgent is not actually selfish necessarily, because you're trying to tap into something that is more broadly meaningful, and following those impulses is a way to more potently create the thing that will hopefully then be potent for others. Or maybe I'm just finding a really convoluted way of justifying my own self-indulgence. Again, others can decide that, but that's what I perceive. And so I wanted to let that process unfold, again, organically over a period of time. The recording process happened in fragments over the course of a year. Some of the, like Cliff Palace, the excerpt from which we were listening to, was recorded live in the studio in New Haven, actually, at Firehouse 12. And but a lot of the other pieces were recorded, maybe the rhythm section together, and then horns in another studio somewhere else, and then vocals in another studio somewhere else, some people recording at home if they were equipped to do so. so that happened over the course of a year, and I was pretty determined to, on the one hand, be very organized and task oriented. Boy, if you could see all the spreadsheets. And at the same time, be be in a position where I could savor that experience and savor the capacity to connect with each of the people who performed. Most, if not all, of whom were people who I considered to be, and there were still people who I wished I could invite. And at a certain point, I'm like, this can't go on for 8 years and become like a quintuple album. At a certain point, I just have to say enough. But I wanted to actually enjoy that experience of being with those individuals and sharing musical and emotional space with them, rather than being so task oriented that it was okay, yeah, it's a good enough take, thanks, bye, next. That would be antithetical to the kind of experience that I wanted to have, and that I wanted the people participating to have. I mean, a lot of them were people who were close to Claire in one way or another, friends, collaborators, and in some cases it was people who didn't know Claire but knew how impacted I was by that experience, and so there was still a sense of emotional potency. I don't think, unless they did a good job of faking it, I don't think anybody just showed up to punch the clock. Um, and so yeah, so I guess there were points at which I did look at what I had so far and say, okay, you know what's missing is, or I wonder if this thing that I've been hearing will or won't fit here. And at that point, increasing a producer and thinking how things would flow and how things would evolve and contrast. One of the things I did a sort of vignette, like a 1.5, 2-minute long piece that used some of the thematic material from Cliff Palace, but in just a wordless voice and piano version, because it was clear that the song Love Right, which I had actually written for Claire's memorial, going from that directly into the last song, which is a version of a song by the Canadian singer-songwriter Bruce Cockburn called Joy Will Find a Way, a really gorgeous song about mortality. But it was too abrupt. Ending with the song Love Right, it's very, for an instrumental piece, it's pretty raw, and I felt like it was a little too fragile a place to end, but it was too abrupt to go right from that into Joy Will Find a Way. So, like, a week before I was doing the session for Cliff Palace, which was where I laid down all of the acoustic piano because they have such a lovely Steinway at Firehouse 12, I had to, well, I didn't have to, but I'm like, okay, let me come up with an arrangement of this that I can record that will serve as the kind of glue getting from Love Right to Joy Will Find a Way. But I'd say the bulk of the generative process was kind of figuring out how to use sound and in some cases words to sift through these complicated emotions. And of course, there's something where there's a string quartet, and so I still have to actually make sure that I'm working with instrument ranges and voice leading and writing things that are coherent and musically successful. It's not just like I felt an emotion and that stuff came out without any conscious decision making. But there's a point, I don't think I feel very good about this, I don't think any of these pieces reached that point of mundane decision making or task completion before I had a really solid and at least internally emotionally potent sense of what I was trying to create or communicate or excavate, I guess, using my imagery from before. Share, I guess.
I guess I'm curious as to how this album has differed from specifically from previous projects you've worked on. Does this seem like a departure to you, or does it fit in your tradition of projects you've worked on?
It's a good question. Both. Both in different ways, but I will, of course, elaborate on that. Uh, the When I first began making records, making albums, collections of music that are assembled and meant to be consumed in a particular sequence, in whatever technological format. I generally had this pattern of going back and forth between an album of whatever tunes I felt like playing with those people who I assembled to make the record, followed by something conceptual. So my first record was some tunes, and my next record was Patch Kit with Ron Carter and Ben Riley, which was a musical expression or depiction of my life and struggles with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, the connective tissue disorder with which I was born. So I don't know if I've been gesticulating enough for people to see the splints on all my fingers. If I haven't yet, I'm sure I will by the end. But and at that point, I was 28 when I tracked that album and thought it was, I thought I could still be playing by the time I was 30, but 35 was a stretch and 40 was kind of a pipe dream, I thought. So I'm 46 now and still making records, for better for worse. And I mean, I'm happy about it. So I went from that to an album of tunes, and went from that to Soul Force, which was a tribute to Martin Luther King's legacy, and then I went to an album of tunes, and sort of back and forth like that. Though retroactively, I've realized that somewhere around 2012, when I formed Resonant Motion, the nonprofit that I direct to address, in particular, to address the intersection of music and positive change. At that point, I kind of made a commitment to have things be message oriented in my own creative work moving forward. But I also realized that my previous two albums of just tunes were actually all tunes that had some kind of meaning also. So that were curated in a way to deliver certain messages and were kind of programmatic in that way. So in that sense, I guess for a long time I've been doing things that are thematically unified and in some cases pretty ambitious. I mean, I did an album called Know Thyself, which is I made the decision, I was just talking to someone about this the other day, to release it as a single 65-minute track because it's an uninterrupted suite. And at that point, people were mostly listening on their iPods. And I'm like, I don't want people shuffling this music. Like, there's literally no silence in 65 minutes. And if people listen to these movements fragmented, like in between their Lil Wayne tunes or whatever, that's just not going to be a coherent presentation of what this music is meant to be. And and then my Rock and the Redemption album, which is one of two of my records that Claire performed on, is again an album length, concert length suite. So in that sense, taking on a large project and then doing all of the mundane things to pull it together so that it actually becomes a thing, that's not new to me, and that's pretty typical at this point. With my physical issues, if I'm going to go through the strain of making sound and going to studios and playing and shedding to get ready for stuff, there needs to be something more on the other side of that for me than just this tune kind of sounds good. There's a lot of people out there who can make sounds that are pleasing, and if that were my only contribution to the world of sound waves, then I would probably retire at this point, or just be an educator at this point and not perform or record or compose, because I wouldn't really have anything to say that was worth the physical burden. So I have had things to say, and I'm not that new to doing things that are emotionally vulnerable, though this is taking it to another level. What is probably having this many different musicians, I mean, having each track be different in that way is new, and probably something I don't expect I'll do again, at least on an album project necessarily. Um, I Some of the things that influenced me most, or that inspired me most coming up to this, were actually multi-artist compilations. There's this album from the early 80s, maybe they even have it at the library at Yale, called That's the Way I Feel Now, produced by a guy named Hal Wilner, who died of COVID this spring, unfortunately, but who he was one of the main musical behind-the-scenes figures for Saturday Night Live for the last several decades, and so it's a two LP set. I should have dug it out of my shelf of monk tunes, but they're Thelonious Monk tunes done by this completely eclectic group of, in some cases, jazz musicians, in some cases, rock musicians, in some cases, unlikely combinations of musicians forming ensembles. So you go from people who are legit rock stars playing guitar on a monk tune, to John Zorn playing shuffleboil on duck whistles, like bird whistles. Anyway, so just that idea that, aside from the common threads of me and of the thematic material about Claire, it was as if it was a compilation where each track was a different band. So that was different. The other thing that was different along those lines is the stylistic diversity. And I have gotten increasingly willing to own the eclecticism of my own tastes as I've gotten older, but usually there's some kind of glue because it's the same band. So even if this song is inspired by gospel music, and this song is inspired by bebop, and this song is inspired by Delta blues, the shared personnel and shared instrumentation makes it all sound like it's of the same, I don't know, DNA, so to speak. So this was a leap, and I think when I listened to it, I think a successful leap. We'll see again what others think. In trusting that the tell me if this makes sense, that the unity of my own vision and my own, hopefully, inner coherence as a person, as an artist, would tie it together, and beyond that I didn't need to worry about where, if record stores were still a thing, I mean, I know they're a little bit still a thing, what shelf would this go on? Because there's instances where it goes from like a neo soul tune to like a country folk tune to a chamber jazz tune to something that kind of sounds like it could be on an 80s Peter Gabriel record to a version of a Coltrane spiritual ballad. Like that, had it been an LP, I would have just described side 3 for you. And what shelf do you put that on in a record store? And ultimately, I feel like I'm sufficiently playing with house money at this point, just even still being able to perform, that I decided just not to worry about that and just let it be genuine. And I mean, it was liberating to just think, what does this sound need to be, and not worry about, well, does that fit, or what will the critics at Downbeat think about this? Spoiler alert, the critics at Downbeat are not going to pay attention to this, and that's okay. So yeah, that was, we'll see the extent to which that embrace of eclecticism stays present for me moving forward. I would expect it probably will that Pandora's box is kind of open at this point. So and when I've done more stylistically diverse things in the past, I've tended to compartmentalize it more. So, this project does this kind of music, and this project does this kind of music, and um, ultimately, at this point, I think I'm less concerned about the relatively small subset of my quote unquote fan base um, that only likes certain things I do and would be offended by having to consume a more eclectic array of those things.
So you talk, as I hear you describe this project, and every time I've heard you describe this project, it always strikes me how gargantuan a task it seems to be that you've set for yourself. And I mean, this isn't obviously isolated to this project, this musical project that you've done. As you said, every time you go in the studio is a tremendous physical task and is a thing that you do only because it's worth it for some higher reason than just to put in a record of music that sounds good. Um, I think and that must be difficult to sort of, it puts the bar higher for motivation to go on and do something like that. Um, I think one thing that a lot of musicians have felt in the past, at least a lot of young musicians who I've talked to have felt in the past few months, is some version of that same barrier to any kind of musical production. That it feels like anything we might want to do is so impossibly difficult and so like inconceivably far from the imaginable that it's very easy to throw up our hands and just give up. And you've been remarkable throughout your career at not doing that. And I was curious, what types of are there purely like how is it, what types of things do you think about when you're seeming like you're losing motivation, or do you even feel like you're losing motivation in any way, or are these things you think about at all?
I mean, I think about these things all the time. Just quit. Just quit. No, just kidding. Sorry, I just wanted to see what it was like to say that. But no, don't actually, unless you want to. So I guess I have a few responses to that. One is that, especially in a time like this, motivation can be cyclical, and there are certain things, particularly if you're a performer, just basic physical maintenance that you have to be fairly regimented about, just so you don't lose your chops, basically. And so even if you're not, in some ways, it's actually easiest for me when I'm completely tapped out creatively or emotionally, because I know that all I'm going to be able to do is practice technique. And so, I turn the metronome on and I pick a tune and I play it through 12 keys and or whatever it is I decide that I'm going to be doing for technical maintenance. So, uh, if we think about it as like a well, when I do a big project like this, very often the well is fairly dry by the end, and I've been around that block enough to accept that and know that the motivation will come back. Um, I had I had an experience a few years ago. At this point, how many years ago are we talking? 9 years, maybe, 10 years, where I had finished Know Thyself, which was a very emotionally raw and just energetically exhausting project to do. Just it was difficult logistically and energetically, and it was some very personal content, and I really didn't have much motivation to create after that. I still had motivation to keep my chops going, and a lot of that is just sheer discipline and, like, motivating yourself to be creative or vulnerable is pushing your luck often, I find, but motivating yourself to brush your teeth is just part of being a responsible human. And, you know, keeping up with your basic technical upkeep is like brushing your teeth. It's just a responsibility that you heed if you have chosen a certain path. but the creative stuff, and so what I will often do, and my sort of inadvertently, the musician aid project, which maybe we'll talk about a little later, has provided a vehicle for this kind of thing. But if I work on things that aren't purely generating something from the ground up, what pop musicians would call cover songs, then that's a way to be creatively involved, but from a bit more of a distance. So the project I did after Know Thyself was I took Stevie Wonder's Fulfilling This' first finale album and I arranged the entire thing for my trio at the time. And so that was motivating, but it wasn't like me having to express something because Stevie already expressed it. I just needed to figure out how to make it sound cool for that instrumentation, or not mess it up basically because it's already perfect. But and then my wife Kate, just in a moment of sort of idle, I don't remember how this came up, but in a moment of sort of idle conversation, she said, I challenge you to a songwriting contest. Who can write the best song about the recipe for granola? And she probably forgot minutes later that she had said that. It was just sort of like a, a silly thing in the moment. And it sort of stuck in there. And a couple of weeks later, I did it. And then the next day, another song came to me, like very quickly. And it was a song that, in its initial form, the song about a traumatic childhood experience through the lens of talking about my teddy bear, but presented as if it were metaphorical, except it actually isn't, and in the form of like a late 70s Neil Young grunge song. And my first reaction to this coming to me was, well, what the F am I going to do with this? Like, I'm a jazz musician. What am I going to do with, Granola, which is more of like a bluegrass tune? That was just like a fun thing that I could show Kate that I had done, though I have subsequently performed it. And but this other song, what was I going to do with that? And I had a moment, which I will share with you. I don't think I've talked about this that much, but I had a moment of sort of reckoning where I said, okay, the well has been dry for a while. At that point, it had been maybe 2 years since I finished Know Thyself, and maybe I'd written like a couple tunes along the way, but really, I had emptied the tank and it had been empty for a while. And I'm like, the muse is now motivated to speak to me. And if I were a muse and I said, hey, here's a gift, and the person to whom I gifted that sound said, yeah, not really what I was hoping for. What else have you got? Then would I be motivated to come up with something else, or would I turn around and leave? And I didn't want the muse to turn around and leave. And so I just said, okay, well, when an idea comes, I'm going to write it. And so for the next 6 months, I averaged a song a week, all of which were outside of the jazz realm. And if you're really interested, and I don't know why you would be, but maybe you would be. 5 of these tunes I cleaned up just a little bit. These are like one-man band things where I'm like playing drums and guitar and bass, and I think there might be one tune where I played a little bit of keyboards, but for the most part, or two, I was trying to stay away from an instrument where I had any virtuosity, so that I could just go for the rawness and the playfulness. So that I put that out as an EP called "I Want You to Know." Under the pseudonym Are You Sure? But so these songs just kept coming to me, and I just kept going with the flow and recording them and writing them. And some of them were actually fit for public consumption, and some of them were kind of gnarly musically, and some of them were so starkly personal that it would be completely ludicrous for me to share them with anyone except for my therapist and my wife. And So those are the two people who have heard some of those songs. But I just kept, I'd like, as long as these are the ideas that are coming, I'm going to go with it. And then after 6 months of that, I started having ideas that were more relevant to what I defined as my performing identity. Um, and I, so a lot of the material on my Ripples album and some of the germs of ideas for the Rock and the Redemption suite came from that period of basically the year that followed those 6 months of obeying the muse. And I got several years of creative energy out of that momentum before the well ran dry again. And the reason I tell this story is that it goes against what you might think of. I mean, again, we're making a distinction between inspiration and just sort of disciplined production. And if just writing a thing for the sake of writing a thing is something that needs to be part of your disciplined production, then you just need to do that because, again, it's like brushing your teeth or changing your oil or whatever. It's a thing that you have to do on a schedule that you didn't choose. But as far as feeling uninspired or feeling like there are other emotional things that you need to tend to at a particular moment, that's just being human. And I I personally don't aspire to be someone who ignores those things. At one point, maybe I did because I believe that's what you're supposed to do if you're a serious artist. But ultimately, pushing through that because I need to create, because I'm an artist, and I need to create the thing that I've already contrived needs to be created. That's not sustainable. That's not. And if you do sustain it, you sustain it by becoming the kind of person who is maybe not entirely a net positive to the universe. And who needs that when one of the main points of doing music is to actually make the world a little better than it might have been if you didn't. So in terms of just dealing with feeling displaced or unmotivated or whatever, part of that is finding what you can do that moves you forward in those moments. So, like, I generally keep a list of tasks that if I'm feeling scatterbrained or unfocused, but it's work time, then I look at the list and okay, well, at least I can do this thing so that this is metaphorical, but when the moment comes when I'm inspired, at least I won't have to walk away from that moment to clean the cat litter because I already took care of that when there was nothing else I really could do. And as far as doing ambitious things, the two keys to that I find from my own practice, your mileage may vary, but one is to break what you've chosen to do down into finite achievable tasks. So if you wake up in the morning, when I first wrote my first series of instructional books, I was young, and it was a huge task on a pretty tight timeline, and I had an outline and I knew what was going to be on every page, and that was demanded by the publisher, and I was pretty frustrated that I was being boxed in that way, but it totally made it possible for me to do it because if I woke up in the morning and thought, holy crap, how am I going to do all of this, then I would have curled up in a fetal position and not accomplished much, or I would have been more easily distracted. But because I woke up and thought, well, today my job is to write pages 37 through 39, and this is what is on pages 37 through 39, then those were achievable tasks. And I think the other thing, and this is something that to me ties in well with the ethos of jazz more generally, creative, generative music. Generative meaning you are creating some of the content rather than, with no disrespect to most European art music, for example, there's an existing score and your job is to obey it, and hopefully you obey it expressively and so on, but you are not creating the core content that's being put forth. So when you have the responsibility of creating at least some of that content, either because you're composing or because you're improvising, you have to decide what your threshold is for imperfection, or to put it another way, whether you're driven by coming up with something decent, or whether you're driven by pursuing the beyond, which inherently creates risk of coming up with something that's kind of rough around the edges. I find Coltrane to be a really important model of this, because for someone who was as ridiculously technically proficient as he was, you hear him play things a lot that are, I don't want to say sloppy, but rough around the edges, where he goes for a note and he doesn't get it, or he goes for a phrase and it doesn't come out perfectly. And it's not because he didn't practice enough, it's because in that moment he's reaching for the beyond, and the possibility of that beyond is more important to him than the guarantee of clean execution. Because if he wanted to just like run some bebop lines that sounded clean, he was more than capable of doing that. And I've adopted that more generally as a philosophy of pursuing artistic things, where like I'm much more motivated by the possibility of something being transcendent than the guarantee of it being pretty good. And this happens in other facets of my life where I get in trouble. I go to the restaurant and I'm like, well, I know this. Well, again, when going to a restaurant was a thing. This thing, or even if I'm cooking, like I know that if I make it this way, it'll be really good. And if I'm feeding my family, then I'm going to do that because I don't want to put them at the mercy of my experiment, or if I'm going to a potluck or something. But if I have some agency and like I am willing to eat the thing that didn't work if the process of pursuing it meant there was some possibility that either I would do the thing that was better than anything I could have expected, or that I learned something along the way that means that maybe next time I will go from having a 30% chance to a 35% chance of getting that thing that's delightful. And so it's a lot harder to pursue an ambitious project if you are afraid of quote unquote failing, if you are concerned that if you're concerned that something being rough around the edges or just not quite working the way you wanted it to will diminish the value of the experience, then it's actually valid to be less ambitious, because that ambition carries with it certain risk. And part of this comes for me when I was a student around the corner from the Yaleys at the Educational Center for the Arts, the Arts Magnet High School in New Haven, where Wayne Escoffery was one of my classmates. I remember, I'll spare you all the details, but I remember going from class there, and I was actually taking a theory class at Yale at the time, a music theory class, and I remember going from my theory class to a Tom Petty concert. And if you're all jazz heads, maybe that name doesn't mean anything, but a rock star of the late 70s through, I guess he was still commercially relevant through, say, the mid-90s, and then maybe more popular as I wouldn't say a nostalgia act, but it's not like people were buying lots of his new records. Anyway, so Tom Petty, singer-songwriter, nothing jazz about it, and I went to see him in concert that night. It was the third time I'd seen him in concert, and it was really good, and it was pretty much the same as the first two, and I was pretty disappointed by that, because although it was good, it wasn't giving me a new experience. And then the next night, I went up to Boston to hear the Grateful Dead, and this was maybe the 8th time I had seen the Grateful Dead, and by any objective metric, it was a worse show than the Tom Petty show I had seen the night before, but it was a more satisfying experience for me because they were going for things. And as they were going for things, there was the possibility that they would land somewhere transcendent. And I realized about myself that weekend, that began from walking away from my theory class at Yale, that I am a person who is more motivated by the possibility of the transcendent than the guarantee of the pretty good. And on a really good night, the Grateful Dead did achieve something that was transcendent, like I've never heard in a more sort of, for lack of a better term, working class rock band or funk band or whatever. And I wasn't necessarily, my direct musical inspiration from the Grateful Dead didn't carry much past that point, but that philosophical relationship to ambition did. And then as I got into jazz, I started digging into people like Coltrane, who were as rugged, or Wayne Shorter, who were as rugged in pursuing the transcendent, but also, with all due respect to the Grateful Dead, they were much better musicians. And so it wasn't like the level of failure on a bad day was not, it wasn't like a Grateful Dead failure where I would be standing there thinking, I can't believe I spent, a month and a half of my allowance for this ticket. But, studying with Kenny Barron for 6 years, on a bad night, like on a really bad night where it's like, wow, this is Kenny off, and like I know he hasn't slept well in days and there's stuff going on, like it was still A minus, like on the worst day. And the transcendent days was like, okay, this is why I'm doing this. This is why I'm putting my body through this. This is why I care about sound. But it's kind of a subtle difference from the outside in a way, because it wasn't like it was terrible on the bad day, but you'd hear him, and I see that in his spirit now. I mean, he just turned 77 over the summer, and he still defines himself by his pursuits and by the shortcomings that he's looking to mitigate. And as I've told this story before, so forgive me, but the first time I brought my oldest daughter to hear him play, he was telling me about a project that he was working on, and I said, "Wow, that I thought was. Have you ever done such and such before?" And he said, "No." And I said, "It's really inspiring that you're not resting on your laurels after all that you've accomplished." And he laughed and he said, "I wish I had laurels. Like I would really enjoy resting on them, but I don't have them. I'm just still trying to figure out how to do this." And I think that kind of, when you're being ambitious, it may seem antithetical or contradictory somehow, but being ambitious and being humble go very well together, I find. Sort of recognizing, this is not me trying to achieve the magnum opus that will prove that I'm a better human than the bullies who made fun of me in high school or whatever. Like, this is just, I am a servant to this thing, and I'm being called to try to do this with it, and let's see if I can do that. And there's a certain peace in that, even if the actual doing is difficult and complicated.
And so you were talking about this in the perspective of Kenny Barron, who, obviously or John Coltrane, who's like generally regarded as even though obviously John Coltrane saw himself as always a student and always beneath others, but as an actual like real student, like in university or in high school, I don't know, like, did you already have this attitude of, or like, is it, because there's a certain perspective, I struggle with this, of like doing more ambitious things versus just being like, I'm going to do something well that's simple to build up the capacity so that later on you can reach for the stars or whatever. Or I don't know, does that not, or you said there's sort of two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, I think you kind of have to do both. ideally when you do something ambitious, I mean, when high school students who can barely, and I assume it's mostly jazz folks watching this, so I'll get a little bit nerdy. When a high school student who can barely make it through a standard asks me to teach them giant steps, I know that that's an ego thing and not something where they've systematically built up the infrastructure to be organically ready for that. So when they say, "Can you teach me giant steps?" what that usually means is my ego is fragile, and that's okay. Whose isn't? And from what I've heard, if I can play giant steps, then that will say something about me. That will prove something about my validity as a musician. And if my ego is tied up enough in that, then as a human being, um, and I'm really impatient to get to that point where like I'm legit. So can you teach me giant steps so I can be legit? Um, and I'm grateful to the guy I knew when I was a freshman in college who I heard practicing Coltrane solo on giant steps through the practice room door faster than the original recording with great precision. And then once I got to know him, realized he couldn't actually like make the changes on a blues. And it really was about um, proving something to people on the other side of the practice room door as opposed to systematically building up a skill set. So ideally, when you do something ambitious, you have calculated that there is some chance that it will work as a way of pulling together things that you have organically learned how to do. So writing, I mean, by the time I started writing ambitious suites, I had written hundreds of 16 to 32 bar tunes. Um, so a lot of it is doing the mundane thing over and over again until it makes sense to try the ambitious thing. And then I try the ambitious thing, and sometimes, I mean, it never works. I mean, let's be honest. Like, I've never done an ambitious thing where I'm like, you know, every note of this is exactly what I wanted it to be. But on a good day, you know, I'd say that on Know Thyself or The Rock and the Redemption, or, you know, at least 70 or 80% of it works. And the stuff that doesn't work is still fine. It's just not what I heard in my head. It's not the thing I was reaching for. Um, you know, we'll see how I feel in a couple years about Love Right. At this point, I feel like I pretty much got most of it, although that's in large part more the relationship equity I had in gaining the participation of wonderful people. Um, you know, like it's not because of me that it sounds as good as it does. It's because of all these great musicians who contributed to it. Um, so I think doing the ambitious thing and just knowing that it might not work, and it might not work for reasons that are because you're not good enough, or it might not work for reasons that are beyond your control. You know, I was telling the same student who I was talking to this morning about the inner compass and self-indulgence and not bad. We were talking about an experience I had when I was in my early 20s, and I wrote a string quartet, and a couple other people wrote string quartets, and we lined up some more advanced students to play it, and they totally butchered my string quartet, and the end. You know, that was the one opportunity I had to have that played, and it sounded terrible, and I think it mostly wasn't my fault, but it was what it was. I still got something out of the experience. I pilfered some of the thematic material from it for other pieces subsequently. If I was motivated enough, I could have digitized it and gotten someone else to play it at some point, but I got what I needed to out of the experience. So I think a mixture of doing the mundane, quote unquote, little things and the ambitious things is part of it. And part of it is just not being so precious about it. If you do the ambitious thing and it doesn't work, then hopefully you went into it from an emotional place where your primary goal was to learn something from the experience rather than gain validation or status or whatever through that experience. Does that distinction make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to switch gears a little bit and try to get some questions off of Facebook because this has been streaming live. Real quick before that, a theme today has been reaching for the sublime. And I remember early on when we were first emailing about this, you mentioned you were working on perfecting your vegan cheese recipe. So I was wondering whether you managed to make that, or if it's still a little rough around the edges.
Um, that's actually a really good example, ironically. Both.
Okay.
So at this point, with all due humility, I am making vegan cheeses that A are better by a pretty wide margin than any others I've ever had, and B are good enough that Kate, who is quite fond of dairy cheese, actually enjoys and will sometimes go for ahead of whatever dairy cheese we might have in the drawer. And I am also so I am enjoying that and also trying variations on the recipe that are sometimes not working, because now that I know that I can do this, the response is not just keep doing this, but okay, use that as a foundation, but let me try this. Nope, that was kind of gross, or some step along the way went haywire, or so yeah, so all of the above. I think I wouldn't say I've perfected it, but I've gotten it to a very satisfying point and am not yet resting on those laurels.
Great. You'll have to share that recipe with me sometime.
Right on. It's more of a process than a recipe, but I'm happy
Oh,
to.
I see.
Well, thank you. I'm gonna now read off from the Facebook. So the first question is from Zach. Hi, Zach.
Hi, Zach.
Um, if you have so it says you have played a lot of Stevie Wonder. What are some of your favorite songs or albums, and have you had the chance to see him live?
um, I'm laughing, so I'm going to tell you a story. I don't know if I mentioned this in the beginning. Stevie Wonder is sort of one of, next to Coltrane, he is my foundational person. Let me take a little water. It was seeing him on Sesame Street when I was a kid that made me know I wanted to be a musician. So anybody who knows me, forgive me for hearing that story for the 6 millionth time. But um, I am particularly fond of the early complete self-empowerment era. So basically, um, it's really interesting to listen to where I'm coming from and music of my mind, but um, Talking Book, Intervisions, Fulfilling This is First Finale, those three are just as a body of work um, that defines Stevie for me. And there's a few, some tunes that I love more than others, but there are no clunkers on those three records. And then I love Songs in the Key of Life. Songs in the Key of Life, ironically, is maybe more akin to what I just did with Love Right. I hadn't really thought about that in terms of differences of textures and the long, 2 LP format. And I'm actually really fond of what I would say is sort of that era, though you might say it's the beginning of a different era, which is Hotter Than July, which I think 1980 or 79, 80. I think it's 1980. That one was my jam when I was like, however old I was in 1986. And have I seen him live? Yes, I've gotten to see him live a couple times. At one point, I'll tell you this story. I had tickets to see Stevie Wonder. I'll give you the short version. I had never seen him before, and I was having a really rough time. I mean, this may resonate with those dealing with pandemic life and all of the political strife and reckoning over racial justice that is making it a very emotionally difficult time to be alive. I was having a really rough fall for reasons I won't get into. But I had this Stevie Wonder concert to look forward to. Got to the concert, presented my ticket, and they're like, no, because somehow I like messed up on the Ticketmaster website, and I had bought a ticket for the concert from 2 days before that. So I spent and so the drive home from that was sort of like, wow, this is adding whatever to whatever, insult to injury, or insult to insult, or grief to misery, or whatever. And um, this is gonna sound morbid for a minute, but I'll turn it around. Just because something difficult is happening doesn't mean something else difficult won't also happen. We don't necessarily get to choose how to pace out our adversity. And sometimes we just get the living crap kicked out of us. And, in terms of being ambitious and so on, I guess bringing it back to what we've been talking about before, sometimes it's really just a matter of being determined to get up and try again the next day. And on that occasion, I got out of the fetal position the next day, and lived my life and made food for my kids. And I don't want anybody listening to this to underestimate how important that is. Whether your broader ambitions involve musical greatness or whatever, sometimes it really is just making it through the day, making it through whatever's going on. And so I got to see Stevie again subsequently, which was sort of a happy ending, but more importantly, I didn't need that as a happy ending because I just dealt with it as it happened.
Thank you.
I promise I'm capable of giving mundane answers to straightforward questions, if I haven't done so yet. So thanks for your patience.
Yeah, no, thank you. The next question from Calvin, hi Calvin, is do you have any advice for musicians who are looking to get into songwriting / song creation? And I'm going to just add my own little twist to this question, which is Calvin, I know, is a jazz player and is an improvising musician. And you made a distinction earlier between the sort of toothbrushing of practicing and keeping your chops up versus the inspiration-induced work of composing. And I was curious, sort of, if you could, in some way, like talk about like your songwriting, song creation, and like composing process, and then your practice, like if those are totally distinct processes, or whether they inform one another and one contributes to the other, or you build them as separate things.
Okay. Wow, it's a lot.
All right.
So maybe do you know Calvin enough? Well, and maybe Calvin can chime in here. By songwriting, are we distinguishing songs as like things with lyrics that are more straightforward and accessible than a jazz tune, or could we substitute? Are we talking about like jazz composition versus songwriting, or are those all just kind of synonyms for the same thing? So I'll address a bit of Donnie's thing while we wait for Calvin to respond to that, so that I can address what he's actually asking about. But I would say, I wrote a lot of lousy songs. What really helped, I actually have to credit my 9th grade English teacher with this, because she fancied herself a musician. And so she liked it when I wrote songs to fulfill assignments that were really meant to be essays. And so I began writing songs essentially doing that. Like, okay, well, and I kept doing that through the rest of high school, even though, even in the face of a complete lack of subsequent validation from subsequent English teachers for this. But so thank you, Mrs. Patrick, for, and so what that did is it made me write a lot of songs that I wasn't invested in emotionally. And I think that's one of the most important things for getting into whether it's composing or songwriting. So it might be that I'm answering the question here, is to just do it a lot and to think more about functionality and less about self-expression. It's a really big ask to try to be expressive in a language in which you're not fluent. So like if you want to become a poet, if you're studying a language at Yale and you're not fluent yet, the biggest obstacle for writing poetry in that language is not the depth of your emotional attunedness. It's that you don't know how to find the correct vocabulary and conjugate verbs and so on in that language. And until you achieve that sort of fluency, you're not going to be able to be creative or emotive. And so, I wrote, and this is true with jazz stuff too. Like I was happy to write a 32 bar tune that sounded kind of like such and such, and I just did a lot of that. Um, until I had and put it in front of other musicians enough to see what worked or didn't work, um, and eventually, so it was a sort of disciplined thing, and I put myself in positions where I would have or give myself assignments. I'd say, here I'm in this ensemble. Can I write for the ensemble? And then I was under the gun to actually come up with something. And so by the time I started establishing my own voice, so to speak, as a composer, I had many dozens of creations sort of under the bridge that I was not necessarily emotionally invested in a way that would make me too precious to just learn the thing and move on. Whether it's related to my playing, procedurally it was at one point. At this point, I write when I have something to say that needs to come out that way and not as really a daily discipline thing. That's just me. I do have an issue where I often write stuff that I don't entirely enjoy playing. Like the writer me and the player me are not completely incompatible, but we're not musical soulmates sometimes. So sometimes I have to sort of slog through how to satisfyingly play a thing that writer me thinks is exactly the way it needs to be. And if I write the thing that player me is really into, then writer me is like, meh, okay, I guess it's all right. Enjoy this gift. Enjoy that I'm giving you a blowing vehicle, but don't expect me to do it next time.
Thank you. And Calvin clarified that he said probably both, or he said probably synonyms for the same thing. I'm interested in both. So composition and sound.
So yeah, so I guess the one thing I would say with songs is if it gets into including words, it's also useful. Again, you can do this for yourself if you don't have Mrs. Patrick, or get into some kind of like co-creating group, whether it's online or with friends, where it's like, okay, this week's prompt is we have to write a song about hand sanitizer, or we have to write a song about elbows or whatever, and your job is to write something functional that fits those criteria rather than something that's expressive and soulful and so on. I think the biggest obstacle to learning how to write is not doing enough of it to create the infrastructure, and that in turn is usually because there's this real drive to create a masterpiece, and sort of refine it and get it perfect when it's not actually realistic yet for you to create a masterpiece because you haven't written enough mediocre songs yet. So write lots of mediocre songs. Nobody except for your workshop partners needs to hear them.
Thank you. And we have one more question from the Facebook, and then we'll get to your second piece. So this is from Cole. Remember Cole? He says, thanks for doing this, Noah. Oatmeal a la Bluegrass sounds awesome and hysterical.
Thanks.
How do you figure humor in your own music and projects, or more broadly? And thoughts on Zappa?
I'll go in reverse order. Well, humor can take on, well, maybe it's not in reverse order. I'll sort of get it all at once. Humor can take on a lot of forms. I mean, there's wit and there's goofiness, and there's things that are comedic by their nature, and there's things where there's like a wistful joke within something that is overall more serious. I don't know, I guess I have a mixed relationship with that. I mean, full disclosure, one of my favorite musical artists when I was a preteen was Weird Al Yankovic. I loved his parodies. I loved his original songs. Is he still relevant enough that people know who I'm talking about? Okay. And I loved, ironically, he was my first role model for stylistic eclecticism, because on an album of his, he would be covering so much stylistic grounds. Like here's the reggae tune, and here's the like 40s swing tune, and even just in his original tunes, here's the doo-wop tune, here's the sort of quasi metal tune. And so the idea that the same band would have the versatility and breadth to be able to make things that sounded stylistically authentic in such a wide range of settings. I mean, I wasn't thinking in those terms when I was like 10 and listening to my Sony Walkman or whatever. But yeah, I guess I have a soft spot for humor. In my own music, I I've definitely written some songs, Granola being one of them, that are lighthearted and at times funny, or I like a clever rhyme. Um, Things that are for myself, I've become fairly intentional about what I put into the world. So it's not just following my muse, but also just a sense that there's a certain energy and a certain spirit and a certain core philosophy that it is my privilege slash duty to put forth into the world. And sometimes I'll come up with a really funny, stupid song idea, and maybe I write the song or maybe I don't. But if it doesn't have something, can be funny and still project ultimately humaneness and warmth and and so in those cases I might actually follow through on it and I might actually perform it. I have a duo project with Kate where she plays bass lines on the euphonium and I sing and play guitar. I'm not a very virtuosic guitar player. The group is called Stank Eye Jones and the Vagabond Librarians. And I've written some songs that are very, I don't know, philosophically almost self-helpy, and some that are more funny, but the message behind them is one of positivity. And, if there's humor, it's humor to illuminate things that we as humans deal with, as opposed to humor that is at the expense of somebody or just for the sake of being goofy. So I have mixed feelings about Zappa in that way. In terms of my personal relationship with him, I have incredible respect for him as a musician. I used to listen to him a lot when I was younger. Um, I I don't aspire. I think the the degree to which his wit is cutting that aspect of his music. I find some of his highly technical stuff to be a little cerebral for my tastes, and I find some of his humor to be a bit, if not cruel, at least indifferent to the feelings of those who one could make the case he's trying to empower by drawing attention to absurdities and so on. So I'm glad that he was out there doing what he did. I'm tremendously inspired by him just as an iconoclast who forged his own path and figured out ways to make music that was impractical but very genuine to him. Um, the the general energy field that he puts forth as an artist is not always one that I wish to emulate, even though I still enjoy some of his music.
Thank you so much. I think we should now go to our to it's 5:24, so I think we should
Okay,
have you hear your other song. Do you want to introduce it first, or do you want to
sure.
play it?
Yeah, I'll introduce it first, and then that'll be enough words out of me. So this song, it is the song that would end section one of four, or side one if it were an LP. It's called "Dream Without Me," with music by me and lyrics by Claire's sister Molly. The band, let's see if I get it all. Declan O'Connell on fretless electric bass, Freddie Bryant, who I'm pretty sure got his master's degree in classical guitar at the Yale School of Music, although he is a very prominent jazz guitarist. on classical guitar. Rogério Bocato, the great Brazilian drummer, and his daughter Anne, who was my student for a while, on percussion. She's a great pianist, composer, singer, songwriter. Her group, the Asaran Earth Trio, is totally worth checking out. LaTanya Farrell on vocals and a horn section of Caroline Davis on alto saxophone, Professor Wayne Escoffrey on tenor saxophone, and Brian Chin, who is a professor and department head out in Seattle, on trumpet. And I play organ and a synthesizer solo on this song, Dream Without Me.
Carry me, brother, you're too young. Share me, brother, you're so strong. Remember me, sister, you changed me. Shelter them, they need you. Break down, mama, you can now. Break open, sister, I carry you now. Dream of future. Dream without me. Fly again, mama. It's not your fault.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. I think we're gonna log off from Facebook Live now. Thank you everybody for tuning in. It's been a
Everybody.
pleasure. Thanks for the, and as Jason said earlier, I'm just gonna repeat it, that we're doing more programming this year. Despite it being virtual, we're excited about it anyway. And maybe not even in spite, maybe, I don't know, whatever. But we are excited about we're doing, if you're interested in performing in the Bird Show, please join and stay tuned to our website and our social media and our mailing list for upcoming news. All right, thank you so much.